Every Sunday morning, without fail, Walter arrived at St. Augustine's chapel 15 minutes before the first bell rang. He walked slowly, his steps measured and deliberate, his cane tapping softly against the stone path leading to the heavy oak doors. Rain or shine, winter or summer, Walter wore the same pressed blazer, the same neatly combed white hair, and the same solemn expression. He would nod politely to the usher, accept the bulletin with a quiet, "Thank you," and make his way down the right aisle to the third row. Always the third row. Always the third chair from the left. And beside him, the fourth chair. Always empty. Congregants had long noticed it, how Walter never allowed anyone to sit there, not even when the church was nearly full. Some thought it a superstition, others assumed it was a stubborn habit. But no one asked. They simply respected the quiet dignity with which he carried himself and left the fourth chair untouched. Children whispered stories about it. "That's where his wife used to sit," one girl said. "No," another boy whispered. "He's saving it for God." But Walter never said. He came in, he sat, and when the service was over, he stood slowly, nodded to the pastor, and left. Week after week, month after month, year after year. The same rhythm like a quiet ritual only he understood. Sometimes during the hymns, his lips would move, but no sound came out. And during the prayers, his eyes often drifted not to the altar, but toward the fourth chair, like he was listening for something. Or someone. No one dared interrupt. Even Pastor Reynolds, who had served at St. Augustine's for over a decade, left Walter to his silence. One Sunday, a younger couple visiting from out of town slid into the third row and, unknowingly, sat in both the third and fourth chairs from the left. Walter stood in the aisle looking at them, his face unreadable. The usher hurried down to intervene, whispering gently to the couple and ushering them elsewhere. Walter nodded silently and took his place, his hand resting gently on the back of the empty chair. After the service, someone asked the usher why that seat was always left open. The usher simply shrugged and said, "Respect." But inside, Walter's story ran deeper than anyone imagined. 50 years earlier, in a foreign country with heat like fire and skies full of smoke, Walter had sat shoulder to shoulder with Private James McNeely inside the hull of a transport truck, both of them laughing about a letter James had just received from his sister back home. Walter remembered how the smell of gun oil mixed with jungle air, how every sound seemed too loud, too sudden, and how James, always the optimist, always the loud one, had promised they'd both come back and sit in church together like old men. "Third row, third and fourth chairs," James had said, smirking. "You'll see. Every Sunday, no matter what, I'll bring the coffee." Walter had laughed, smacked his shoulder, and said, "Deal." But James never made it home. The blast took him instantly 2 weeks later. Walter carried his dog tags for years afterward, tucked inside his chest pocket. After the war, he came back home and built a quiet life. A job at the post office. A small house with a garden, no wife, no children, just memories and a promise. On the first Sunday after returning, he stepped into St. Augustine's for the first time since boyhood. He walked down the right aisle, sat in the third chair from the left, and left the fourth chair empty. For James, just in case, he never stopped. Not when his legs got stiff, not when the weather turned rough, and not when fewer and fewer people remembered who James McNeely even was. To Walter, he was still there. He could still hear his laugh when the choir sang off key, still feel his presence when the light poured through the stained glass windows just right. People came and went, pastors changed, choir members moved on, but Walter stayed, always in that same seat, always guarding the one next to it. He never spoke about the war, never mentioned James by name. But if you watched closely during the moments of silence, you'd see him turn ever so slightly toward the fourth chair, as if listening, as if waiting. And every Sunday after the final hymn, Walter would lean in slightly, barely noticeable, and whisper something only he could hear. Then he'd rise, straighten his coat, and walk out the same way he came in, leaving behind an empty chair and a memory that never faded. It was the first Sunday in May when something changed. Walter arrived, as always, 15 minutes before the service. the spring breeze gently brushing his shoulders as he made his way up the church steps. But this time, as he turned into the third row, there was someone already sitting in the second chair. A young boy no more than 10, legs swinging, dressed in an oversized sweater. His parents were a few rows back, heads bowed in conversation. Walter hesitated, not used to company that close. The boy looked up. "Can I sit here?" he asked, pointing to the third chair. Walter gave a small nod and settled in beside him, his eyes flicking briefly to the fourth chair, still empty. "My name's Caleb," the boy whispered. "You come here a lot." Walter didn't respond at first. He wasn't sure how to talk to children anymore, but Caleb was undeterred. "My grandpa used to sit in the back, but he moved away. I like it here better. It's quiet near you." Walter gave a faint smile. "Good choice," he murmured. They sat through the service in silence, but afterward, Caleb didn't follow his parents out. Instead, he lingered, looking at the empty chair. "Do you always leave that one open?" he asked. Walter stiffened. He hadn't been directly asked that question in years. "It's reserved," he said simply. Caleb, in his innocence, asked the question no adult ever dared to. "For who?" Walter looked at him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he said, softly, "A friend." The next week, Caleb returned. This time with a drawing, a stick figure scene of two men sitting on a bench, one with a cane, the other with a coffee mug. He handed it to Walter without explanation. Walter held the paper, something warm flickering in his chest. "Thank you," he said. "That's very kind." "It's you and your friend," Caleb said. "The one who sits there." Walter nodded slowly, folding the picture and placing it in his coat pocket. He didn't say much else that day, but he didn't need to. The presence of the boy had stirred something long dormant. The following Sunday, Pastor Reynolds surprised the congregation by announcing a special Memorial Day tribute for veterans. He invited anyone who served to share their stories, but as always, Walter kept silent. During coffee hour after the service, a woman named Diane, new to the community, approached him. "You're Walter, right?" she asked gently. "My husband told me you served. In Vietnam?" Walter gave a small nod. "Long time ago." "He said you've been sitting in that seat for decades," she said. "Always the same one. And the empty one beside it, he wondered if it meant something." Walter looked down at his hands. "It does," he said. Diane waited, sensing something important was being weighed. After a pause, Walter continued. "I made a promise to someone. We were kids when we signed up. Same unit, same foxholes, same dreams. We said that if we made it home, we'd sit in church every Sunday. Third and fourth chairs from the left." Diane's eyes softened. "But he didn't make it back?" Walter shook his head. "He was the best of us. Loud, stubborn, brave. Took care of everyone. His name was James McNeely." Diane touched his arm gently. "I'm glad you kept the promise." Walter said nothing, but that night, he pulled a small wooden box from his closet. Inside were James's dog tags, faded letters, and a crumpled photograph of the two of them in uniform, grinning like fools. He hadn't opened it in years. He set the photo beside the drawing Caleb had given him and sat in silence for a long time. A few days later, Pastor Reynolds called Walter. "I wanted to ask," he said, "would you consider speaking at the memorial service next week? Just a few words." Walter hesitated. "I haven't spoken about that time in over 50 years. "That's exactly why I think people need to hear it," the pastor said. Walter didn't agree right away, but the idea stayed with him. That Saturday, he sat at his kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and tried to write. Words didn't come easy, but he scribbled out a few memories. Not of gunfire or battle, but of small things. James laughing at a joke, saving a kitten from under a supply truck, singing off key during patrols. On Memorial Sunday, Walter wore his full uniform for the first time in decades. The buttons strained slightly, but the medals still gleamed. As he stepped into the church, people turned. There was a quiet respect, a shift in the air. Caleb waved from the second row. The third and fourth chairs were waiting. After the hymns, Pastor Reynolds called Walter up. The sanctuary fell silent. Walter walked slowly to the pulpit, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He looked out at the faces, some curious, some expectant, all listening. He cleared his throat. "I want to tell you about James," he began. "He wasn't famous. He didn't win any medals, but he kept me alive more times than I can count. We made a promise, one we never got to fulfill together. So I've been sitting in that chair every Sunday, saving a seat for him." A hush fell over the room. Walter's voice grew quieter. "Some people say memory fades, but I don't think it has to, not if we choose to carry it." When he finished, the congregation stood. A quiet, reverent applause filled the space. Walter nodded once and stepped down. As he passed the fourth chair, he touched it gently. That afternoon, Caleb handed him another drawing, this one of a soldier in uniform, placing a hand on an empty chair under a stained glass window. Walter smiled. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was holding the weight alone. Summer arrived quietly, bathing St. Augustine's chapel in golden light that filtered through stained glass like warm memories trapped in time, and Walter continued his quiet routine. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. Ever since the Memorial Sunday speech, people now greeted him not just with polite nods, but with eyes that understood, even if just a little, the burden he carried for over 5 decades. Caleb had become a fixture at Walter's side, always appearing before the service to sit beside him in the second chair, while the fourth remained untouched, the space between them always filled with an unspoken reverence. One Sunday, Caleb brought a small potted plant with a ribbon tied around it, handing it to Walter and saying simply, "For the chair." And Walter, caught off guard, nodded deeply and placed it gently beside the fourth chair, never saying a word but blinking back, something sharp behind his eyes. Weeks passed, and Walter noticed more people leaving notes or flowers at the fourth chair before or after the service. They didn't ask questions, they just seemed to understand that this empty space held a presence of its own. Then came the letter, a plain envelope with no return address. Left on the pew one morning, inside was a faded photograph, grainy but unmistakable, of 2 young men in uniform smiling beside a field tent. And on the back, in trembling handwriting, it read, "I always meant to keep that promise too." Walter's hands shook as he read it again and again, his breath catching as he tried to comprehend what it meant. Was it a cruel joke, a coincidence, or something else? He sat back in the pew long after everyone had gone, staring at the fourth chair as if it might speak. He kept the letter tucked into his jacket pocket from then on, unable to let it go, but unsure what to do with the strange hope it stirred in him. A few days later, Pastor Reynolds called again. "You might want to come by the rectory," he said. "There's someone here who says he knows you." Walter, cautious but curious, made the slow journey to the church office, where a man in his early 70s sat, his hands weathered and trembling, his eyes red-rimmed with something more than just age. When Walter entered, the man stood slowly, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a dog tag, Walter's dog tag. "I carried this for 50 years, the man said. "You gave it to me when you thought I wouldn't make it." Walter stared at him, not breathing. "James," he whispered. The man nodded slowly. "They said I died, but I didn't. I was taken, a POW for years, then moved, shuffled, forgotten. I only got home last year." Walter sat down hard in the nearest chair, the world spinning. "I left letters everywhere. I checked the old addresses. I didn't think—" "I waited," Walter said hoarsely. "Every Sunday, I waited in that chair." They sat in stunned silence, the weight of 50 years settling between them, heavier than grief, lighter than a miracle. Finally, James broke the silence. "Can I sit with you this Sunday?" And Walter, nodding slowly, said, "Third chair from the left. The fourth is yours." The news spread quietly, and that Sunday the church was full, not with spectacle, but with reverence. Caleb sat on the end, eyes wide with wonder, and Walter and James sat side by side. For the first time since their youth, the congregation stood as the organ played, and not a soul missed the way the 2 men leaned slightly toward one another during the hymns. sharing words only they could hear. After the service, many stayed behind just to see them, two living echoes from a forgotten war, fulfilling a promise made long ago in the dust and heat of battle. Weeks turned to months, and their visits to church became ritual again. This time together, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, but always side by side in one crisp autumn morning. As the leaves began to fall, Walter arrived alone, his steps slower, his eyes softer. He placed a folded flag on the fourth chair and sat down with a heavy heart. James had passed quietly in his sleep just days before. But Walter came anyway, as he always had. And for one last time, the fourth chair was filled, not by presence, but by memory. After the service, Walter stood and addressed the congregation with a voice steady but low. He kept the promise. All these years later, he came back, he said, so I can finally rest too. The next Sunday, the third and fourth chairs were empty, but on each lay a single white flower, placed there by Caleb, who now understood better than anyone what those chairs had meant. As time passed, a small plaque was placed on the back of the fourth chair, engraved with simple words, reserved for a friend never forgotten. And the story of the promise lived on, told in hushed tones to new visitors and children, curious about the empty chair in the third row. And every now and then someone would sit there, hand resting gently on the worn wood, feeling something they couldn't quite explain, something like honor, like love, like the echo of a bond that outlasted war, time, and silence.